And we're back for episode 2 within part 1 of the Amsterdam Torture Museum. And this is where we left off. Some text describing the overall thrust of the exhibit with respect to torture and human rights. And as I pointed out, this operative word, the bodies. The theory of the body figures prominently in an analysis of torture. And let me give you some examples of how the body is introduced into these rituals of punishment. Pillories and stocks. Now, what we're referring to here is a technique of punishment and torture known as stress and duress. Putting the victim in an awkward, uncomfortable posture for prolonged periods of time has been part of the larger repertoire of punishment for centuries. And as we will discuss later in this course, stress and duress as a combination of techniques continues to be used by state operatives, especially in the current campaign in the so-called War on Terror. I'm foreshadowing. I'm just giving you a little bit more information in advance that will unfold a little bit later. Let's read the text. The villainy of lawbreakers was exposed with the aid of stigmatizing tokens. Stigma, a sociological concept, made famous by the work of Irving Goffman. Stigma is the mark of social disgrace. Pillory stocks and cages of public disgrace. Here you have the spectacle, putting the victim on display to convey a semiotic message about the norms and punishments that are designed to keep those norms intact. Ordinary elements of street scene in every European city. The public was invited to take part in ridiculing the unfortunate wrongdoers. Collective punishment. That's a tricky word. In this context, it means that members of the community can participate in punishment. Collective punishment can also refer to as groups of people who are identified as a target for punishment. But here I want to talk about how this collective activity enhances and perpetuates the enthusiasm surrounding torture and punishment. Sometimes the court even supplied rotten eggs. That is, that local people could participate by throwing items, rotten eggs, small vermin, to participate in the distribution of pollution. Remember in the previous episode we talked about pollution as a binary to the sacred. More about that later. The more those sentences were laughed at, the more lucid the message that the lawful authorities were to be taken seriously. That is social control, part and parcel to social control. What is that? I'm not going to tell you. I'm going to create a little bit of suspense. Allow you to use your imagination of what that is and how it might have been used on another human being. One of the things you're going to hear me say repeatedly throughout this episode and others is that when it comes to thinking up various ideas of how to inflict pain, punishment, and cruelty on another human being, there is no shortage of ideas. You see this circular item? More about that later. Build a little suspense. And what this engraving illustrates is how this particular stress and duress technique, by way of a wooden frame, would punish two individuals simultaneously by trapping them by way of their head as well as their hands in close proximity, facing each other, put on public display so everyone's getting a good laugh out of that. And here you have another engraving. This wooden frame is attached that allows the contraption to once again punish two people at once. And as you can see by the expression of the people in the foreground, they're having quite a chuckle. And yeah, it's funny. As long as it is not you. If it's you, it's not funny. That is the one-way direction of pain, punishment, and the public spectacle. As long as it is somebody else, it can be funny. Here we see how these wooden frames express ingenuity, a certain craftsmanship. You might notice that it resembles a violin. It even has a tuning peg. Somebody had to come up with that idea, and then someone had to convince a craftsman, a carpenter, to put that idea into a tangible item, instrument for torture. Here we see the metal version of that contraption, with the head in this opening, and then one wrist, two wrists, and fastened tightly and put on display. And once again we see this other item. You can see there's a hook that fastens these two symmetrical panels, forming an enclosure around the neck, the body, stress and duress, the body as the target for how these authorities distribute and perpetuate their power. Now, if you want a little bit more historical context, we can look at this poster. Wearing stones and other burdens around the neck is an old religious penance. So once again, we see religious and moral forces shaping the overall direction of punishment as an expression of power. Judges often ordered symbolic processions instead of corporal punishments or fines. Symbolic processions, rituals, public displays, these spectacles. The neck violin is a later variant of the slander stone, which featured inscriptions such as, "He who lusts for quarrel and hate shall carry me around the state." It was also a twin version in which quarreling women were locked together until they promised to control themselves in the future. Now, we saw an illustration of that. Women are oftentimes punished differently than men in medieval society, especially along lines of public behavior, complaining, using bad language, quarreling, so on and so forth. behaviors that are not ladylike, and punishment and torture oftentimes channeled through the reinforcement of those degrees of social stratification. Again, more sociology. Let's look at some more items on display. Now, what I'm doing here is showing you an image for purposes of foreshadowing. I'm not going to tell you what this thing has been used for, this wheel. But later in this episode, or maybe the next one, we're going to see how this wheel was used by the torturer and the executioner. But let me point out something that is part of the overall framework for museum studies, which is how these objects are put on display within a particular atmosphere and space. This is what I refer to as boutique lighting. You notice that it has a bluish tone, and color creates mood. And oftentimes these moods are ambiguous. They're often subjective. Individual visitors experience colorization differently. But nevertheless, curators oftentimes introduce color lighting to enhance a certain performance. Once again, these museums are storytelling institutions, and they rely on performance. You notice that the stairs are also illuminated. Entering another space, entering another room, is a phenomenological process. We think differently when we enter a different space. When you go through your apartment, the living area has a different function and a different form and a different feeling than the kitchen. Okay? And museum studies pay attention to the use of space by way of creating rooms and creating elevation by way of stairs, to create the sense that we're going someplace else, and perhaps because it's elevated, it's going to take on additional significance. Again, I'm being sociological, I'm drawing on cultural sociology, but it's important that we do this along the way so that we have context to which we can analyze torture and human rights. And this engraving gives us an idea of how individuals were confined to these wooden frames. Sometimes clearly stress and duress of putting the victim on his back, plugging his legs through the holes. In this case, he seems to have one hand free and one foot free. You can surmise, you can guess that he probably paid off the guard. That's how guards made their living. Oftentimes they were not given a wage or a salary. They were actually paid by the families of those people that they held. And this is what it would look like in the public square. Again, the city is drama. You can see these unfortunate souls with their feet protruding, stress and duress. Try sitting like that for a long period of time, right? And you see the townspeople inspecting, so on and so forth. So they're part of the ritual. And this is the real deal. This was preserved by historians, conservationists, who were able to keep these items from being destroyed and allowing them to be put on display so that visitors can actually grasp the enormity of history. History is important. History sets the record straight. And these torture instruments on display in the Amsterdam Torture Museum set the record straight. And with that, I'm going to pause, get another cup of coffee, come back and talk more about the Amsterdam Torture Museum. Cheers.